This talk that I'm going to give is on the myths of market failure. And to give you a little perspective, in the course of my career, I used to publish quite a bit in the area of antitrust and industrial organization. And one of the things I published in an article a long time ago in a journal called Economic Inquiry was about the origins of antitrust and what economists were thinking about antitrust regulation at the time the first antitrust law was passed, the Sherman antitrust law in the United States in 1890, the year 1890. And one of the things I found was that the American economics profession was almost unanimously opposed in principle to the whole idea of antitrust regulation. They thought it was inherently incompatible with the whole idea of competition. And the reason was they thought of competition, like the Austrians do, as a dynamic, rivalrous discovery process that involves entrepreneurship. It's ongoing, never ending. And they saw what was happening in their economic world at the time. There was a merger wave in the late 1880s in the United States. But they saw prices falling, output expanding. They saw new products, hundreds of new products being created. There was deflation for 35 years after the American Civil War, and they thought it was all good. It was all this competition, so they didn't see the merger wave of the time as a bad thing. That pretty much was the thinking until you get to around the 1920s and 30s, and the theory of competition changed. And the theory of competition that was held by those who called themselves professional economists became the theory of perfect competition. I don't know, maybe Peter Klein covered some of this in the last lecture, in the last class, but all of a sudden, the thinking of competition went from dynamic, rivalrous entrepreneurship, the way Adam Smith saw it, the way the Austrians have always seen it, to this weird theory that says competition means many firms producing homogeneous products, homogeneous prices, costless entry and exit, and perfect information. And as Friedrich Hayek wrote in a famous article of his called The Meaning of Competition, in perfect competition, there is no competition. It's all assumed away. And so if you define competition in that way, that led to a huge industry in the economics profession of market failure theory. And the 1950s was probably the high point of the market failure theorizing, where there was market failure everywhere, because after all, nothing on earth is perfect. And so if you posit that this is what perfection is, and then you compare the real world to that, I sometimes call it this. You compare the real world to this bizarre model of utopia, and you say, aha, the market has failed. And so there were hundreds, probably thousands of articles written by economists, labeling anything that happened in the market as a failure because it failed to reach this. And it got to the point of absurdity. Even by the 1970s, the late Robert Bork, who taught antitrust law at Yale for, I think, 17 years or something like that, he wrote a book called The Antitrust Paradox. And there's a funny line in there. My favorite line in the whole book is that he said if the government actually tried to enforce perfect competition on the U.S. economy, it would have the same effect on wealth as several strategically placed nuclear explosions. And he wasn't an Austrian. I never thought of him as an Austrian economist, but he was a Chicago school law and economics guy. So he knew a bit about economics, and he wrote some pretty good things about that subject. And so you had this whole list of market failures based on basically what the economist Harold Demsetz called the nirvana fallacy. And this was in an article that Harold Demsetz, I'll write his name down here, for those of you who have never heard of Demsetz. He was a UCLA professor. Which I always thought he was very close to being an Austrian, although he never called himself an Austrian. But the way he wrote about markets was very consistent with with things that you'd expect to see from Peter Klein, for example, with the emphasis on entrepreneurship and a dynamic market. And so I always thought of him as a fellow traveler of the Austrians. But he coined this phrase in an article in the Journal of Law and Economics. I think it was 1969, 1970. It was called Information and Efficiency. I think it was called Two Viewpoints. And so that's the nirvana fallacy. And so what I have here in this list is 4 reasons why I think there are a lot of myths about market failure. And then I'm going to talk about some specific myths that I think have been debunked either by me or others. And the first one is the nirvana fallacy. Comparing the real world to utopia, the real world always falls short. The second is the ignoring of entrepreneurship. A lot of the market failure stories are externality stories, for example, and they just condemn the market for not being perfect in some way because they're the presence of externality problems. But human beings are problem solvers, at least some of us are, and especially when there's money involved. If there's money to be made, someone is going to figure out how to make that money. And a lot of times, the so-called externality problems are just that. They are solved by just that means. There's a way of making money in it, and somebody does and solves the problem in doing it. Some of our friends in Montana that run the Political Economy Research Center study what they call enviropreneurship, for example. And I just sent them an article from my local paper. I live in South Florida, and there's a brewery near my house, Saltwater Brewery. I noticed they sell the beer next door, Saltwater Brewery beer right next door. But these guys, I think they're going to make a lot more money by solving an environmental problem than they are selling beer. They're successful selling beer because they just rented out a barn in Delray Beach, Florida, and now I see their beer on tap at Mama Goldberg's. So they're going national and international, but they're environmentalists. And they figured out that there's a problem. If you live on the coast, you see these stories of fish choking to death on six-pack rings, plastic six-pack rings. They got the residue from brewing the beer, and they hired a chemist, and they figured out how to make six-pack rings that are degradable, so that they're good enough to hold 6 packs of beer or Pepsi or whatever. But they throw them into a fish tank, and the fish eat them. They eat these six-pack rings. And the local paper said they just had an order from like Anheuser-Busch for 50,000 of these things. And so that's the first order. So I don't know how much money they're going to make, but if you sell 50,000 of anything, that's a good piece of change. And they didn't. There's money in it. They didn't do it necessarily solely because they love fish or they felt sorry for fish choking to death. They're becoming very rich doing that. So that's the second reason. Third reason is lazy economists who spend their time never getting up out of their swivel chair in their faculty office and theorizing all day long without ever looking out the window to see if the world matches their theories. And then the fourth reason for this that I would give is it diverts attention to problems that are actually caused by government. A lot of problems, monopoly and so forth, that are historically been caused by government, all of a sudden they divert attention to say, no, it's the market that causes all these problems. So those are 4 reasons. So what are some examples that I want to talk about? The first one is antitrust, which I mentioned briefly earlier. And I once did a survey of all the when I was at George Mason University 100 years ago. I got all the books from the library. I had a research assistant that about antitrust law or antitrust economics, and I want to know, well, what are they saying about the origin of antitrust? Because by that time, the Chicago school mostly, and some of the Austrians, had decades of criticism of antitrust in practice. But all the books seem to say, but there was a golden age in the 1880s where antitrust was needed. We may have had 100 years of counterproductive policy that actually makes markets less competitive. But it was good at the beginning, and I wasn't really buying that story. And sure enough, all the books said, yeah, there was a golden age. There was rampant cartelization, rampant monopolization, and government came to the rescue and established the Sherman antitrust law. Okay, and that's the standard story that's still in a lot of the books. And so what I did was I tried to look for the data that would back this up, and found there was none. None of the books had any, not one statistic about any of it. So my research assistant and I dug it up. Went to the Library of Congress. We got all what data, the statistics of the United States from the Census Bureau. And one of the things we found, I'll give you just very briefly what I found. I published this article in the International Review of Law and Economics way back, I think 1984, I think is when it was. But 10 years prior to the Sherman Act being passed in 1890, GDP was growing at 24%. For that 10-year period, GDP, according to the government's own statistics, 24%. The average growth rate of industries that were accused of being monopolies by the U.S. Congress during that time grew at 175% on average. That's 7 times faster. So the industries that were accused of monopolizing industry were growing 7 times faster than the economy as a whole, and the economy as a whole was doing well. It's a period of deflation. The government's CPI fell by 7% during that decade, but these industries that were expanding their production 7 times faster than GDP were cutting prices even further. For steel rails, for example, fell by 53%. That was kind of pretty common during that time. And so what I found was that these industries that were targeted as monopolies, and even involved matches and castor oil that they were complaining about, were the fastest growing, fiercest price cutting, most innovating industries of all. So there was no monopoly. There was no monopoly. The old economists had it right. In my article, An Economic Inquiry, when I followed up from this article to the Economic Inquiry article was published 4 years later, was that the economists of the day got it right. There was nothing to worry about here. Even socialists like Richard T. Ely, the big statist, even he was against the antitrust law at the time. And so that's the first big example I would offer of a myth of market failure. One of the biggest ones. The second big myth is the natural monopoly. And I wrote an article years ago in the Review of Austrian Economics called The Myth of Natural Monopoly. It's online. You Google that and find it. And I was always suspicious of this story also, that the story is still told today in the textbooks is that in the industries with the heavy fixed cost, what industries don't have heavy fixed costs these days, before you get started, we'll have economies of scale. Once it costs a lot of money to build a power plant, but then once you start hooking up individual customers, your costs are mostly fixed, and then you add customer after customer, and so the cost per unit falls sharply. And the basic story is that in industries like that, with economies of scale, there's one big company will achieve economies of scale first, basically, and be able to underprice everybody and become a monopoly. We don't want that. We don't want a monopoly. But there could be a silver lining in the story. The story goes is that, on the other hand, if the government creates a monopoly on purpose, then we can have the advantage of the lower cost for electricity and all these things. But then the government will regulate the price in the public interest, so that we won't have a monopoly price. We'll have a competitive price. That's the theory of natural monopoly. And so, one thing I dug into this too, as had other people, and found out that, well, this was the theory, but it never happened in the United States. It never happened that a natural monopoly evolved in the free market, and then the government came to the rescue with some bureaucrat riding in on a white horse to rescue the consumers. When I had friends working at the Federal Trade Commission, by the way, there's a statue in front of the Federal Trade Commission of a big cement horse and a big strong man, like a professional wrestler wrestling the horse. And I asked my friend Bruce Yandel years ago, who was working there, well, what's this about? What is the horse and the guy? And he told me the horse was runaway government and the man was an economist that was trying to wrestle it down. But actually, I think the real meaning of it is the horse, the wild horse is capitalism, and the big strong he-man was the government. It was taming capitalism. That's just, to this day, it's still there. But again, there's a Harold Dempsey. This is why I was wasn't a student of his, but I liked his writings back in the day when I was researching this. He wrote in his book, Efficiency, Competition, and Public Policy, he did a survey of what was going on in these industries, the natural monopolies at the time, late 19th century, early 20th century. He said this: 6 electric light companies were organized in 1 year of 1887 in New York City. 45 electric light enterprises had a legal right to operate in Chicago in 1907. Prior to 1895, Duluth, Minnesota had 5 electric light companies. During the latter part of the 19th century, competition was the usual situation in the gas industry in this country. Before 1884, 6 competing companies were operating in New York City. Competition was common and especially persistent in the telephone industry, and on and on and on. So there was fierce competition in all these so-called natural monopolies. And I wrote about this in my article. And I used to be a library rat before, when I was early in my career, before the internet. I was a library rat. That's how I got to write articles and books that are sort of investigative. Like, I enjoyed just going through libraries. David Gordon is probably like this too, the Johns Hopkins Library was about a 15-minute walk from my office at Loyola in Baltimore. And one day I'm in the Johns Hopkins Library and I'm looking at all this literature because I knew Richard T. Ely taught at Johns Hopkins. So I went there to see what kind of collection of his writings they had. And I was digging around and I found Ely, and he had written a lot on this subject at the time, early 20th century. And I found an old book on the history of the Baltimore Gas Light Company that Richard T. Ely wrote about. And it tells about the origins of natural monopoly in America, of how it got started. And one of the first states to start it was Maryland, was Baltimore, Maryland. And here's what this book says, how it came into being. In 1890, a bill was introduced into the Maryland legislature that called for an annual payment to the city from the Consolidated Gas Company of $10,000 a year and 3% of all dividends declared in return for the privilege of enjoying a 25-year monopoly. So before that, there was competition, and they sometimes tried to form cartels, but cartels always break down, didn't work. So they run to the government and said, listen, this is how we should do this. Give us a 25-year monopoly and we will share the loot with you, politicians. What was it, $10,000? At that period of time, that was a lot of money. $10,000 a year and 3% of all dividends for a 25-year monopoly. And another old economist I ran across in a journal of Land and Public Utility Economics points out that the whole National Recovery Act was basically like this. When Roosevelt set about to monopolize all manufacturing industry, this was basically the model. Government created monopolies with price-fixing police roaming the streets enforcing the price codes. That was basically how those monopolies were all created. And in this one other article that I ran across by an economist named Horace Gray, he says this. He says, before too long, once they started this with the gas companies and the electric companies, he says, everybody declared, I'm a natural monopoly too. And this included the radio, real estate, milk, airline, coal, oil, and agricultural industries, to name a few. Everybody, don't forget me. I'm natural. I'm as natural as the other guy. And so that's the reality of so-called natural monopoly. It was created by government, but this whole elaborate theory was a big diversion away from the fact that government created it. In the common law, the English common law, much of which was adopted by Americans, monopoly was always defined as a grant by the state. It wasn't until the early 20th century that monopoly was associated with the market. And I think the creation of the perfect competition theory had a lot to do with that, but it was always assumed before that monopoly was a grant by the king or by the parliament or by somebody. Okay, I have a whole list of these fallacies, and I'm going to talk about as many of them as I can, I guess, during the time that I have. The next one is the fable of the bees. This is associated with an economist named Stephen Chung. if you Google Stephen Chung, Fable of the Bees, you find his famous article. And it was famous because in all the economics textbooks in the 1950s and 60s, 70s, they quoted an economist named J.E. Mead. And when you get to the section on externality problems, negative externality problems and positive externality problems. And the example he gave, and this ended up in all the textbooks for a long time, was a situation where you had beekeepers near an apple orchard. And the bees pollinate the apple orchard, and as a result, the apple grower has more apples because his apples are pollinated. And this is a market failure, according to J.E. Mead, because there would be no mechanism for the farmer or the apple grower to pay the beekeeper. And so there's an unpaid resource there, a positive externality. And at the same time, it's reciprocal because the apple trees, the blossoms on the apple trees provide food for the bees. But he said there's no mechanism, though, where there could be any kind of collaboration between the beekeepers who have bees and the apple orchard owner. And so there's these obvious benefits there. So he called for government subsidies of beekeepers. He said to correct this market failure, the government should start subsidizing beekeepers. Now, I always assumed that J.E. Mead must have been a beekeeper on the side, in addition to being a professor at MIT. He had beehives in his backyard or something like that. But anyway, Stephen Chung, he's a professor at the University of Washington. If you went to the grocery store this afternoon to buy apples, half of them in the apple bin would probably be from Washington State, a big apple growing state. And so he did something almost unheard of among academic economists. He got up off his butt and left his office. And he decided to investigate and actually educate himself about the beekeeping and apple growing industries. And he was curious about this. He was in all the books, all the textbooks. And sure enough, what he found was that for generations, they had implicit and explicit contracts between the beekeepers and the apple orchard owners. And they were very explicit, very detailed. For example, they even had things that would say, if we're contractually obligated, if we're going to spray bug-killing poison on our apple trees, we have to give the beekeepers 2 weeks notice so that they get the hives out of there, and we don't want to kill off the bees with the poison that we put on to kill the other bugs on the trees and things like that. And they had payments. They had payments going in both directions depending on the situation, what kind of apple orchard or what kind of fruit orchard you had, and the bees. And so basically what he found was that for many generations, these business people were not as stupid as economists assumed all entrepreneurs are. There was money to be made by collaborating between the beekeepers and the apple orchard owners, and sure enough, if there's money to be made, somebody will figure out how to make it. And so again, by ignoring the whole process of entrepreneurship, economists tend to not even think about private solutions to problems like this. They just assume that it's never ending, and there'd be no end to it. The next example is QWERTY. Who knows what QWERTY is? It's the keyboard. It's the keyboard on a computer. This is the configuration of the keys on a computer. Well, the next type of market failure has to do with what a buzzword that's used for it is path dependence. And the idea is that sometimes in a free market, there will be an inferior technology that will be locked in. The people will use this technology, and there might be better, more efficient technologies out there, but once people adopt it, the market tends to lock it in, and so the whole society becomes less efficient with inferior technology. And there was an economist named Paul David wrote several articles on this quite a few years ago, and he used the QWERTY as an example, as a prime example in a couple of his articles, because there was another keyboard configuration called the Dvorak. I gave this talk at in Prague once. I was invited to give lectures for 10 days at the Prague University of Economics, and the students all laughed when I mentioned Dvorak. He was a Czech, but he was an American, but he was of Czech descent. I don't know why they laughed. They thought it was funny that there's someone from Czech Republic would be in America. So, but they thought that was a funny thing. But anyway, Dvorak, it was a different configuration of the keys, and Mr. Dvorak claimed that his configuration was superior, and then this was way back in the 1940s. He was claiming this, and then Paul David, the economist, in the 70s and 80s, is writing these articles saying, "Well, yeah, the Dvorak configuration. There's evidence that it was superior to the QWERTY, although by then the QWERTY was just a sort of by happenstance, locked in, and the market fails us yet again." And so, anyway, two economists. Leibowitz and Margolis, Stan Leibowitz and Eric Margolis, looked into this, sort of like, and they did apparently what Stephen Chung did, the just unspeakable act of getting off their butts and leaving their faculty offices and investigating the whole computer keyboard industry and becoming sort of experts in the whole thing. And among the things they found was that the evidence of the superiority of the Dvorak keyboard was produced by a naval officer during World War II named Dvorak, and who had a patent on that keyboard, and it was his secretary who did the testing, and claimed that basically his keyboard was superior, and so they did. Leibowitz and Margolis I think they hired somebody to do. They did additional tests of the things, and they found they got pretty similar. There was no extreme difference in one over the other, according to what they said. But the thing is, it wasn't worth it to the consumer to switch. They had an opportunity to switch, just like you can switch from Apple to word processing on your writing in your computers. But once you learn one system, it's just not worth it to a lot of people. Now, if there's a big significant improvement, it might be worth it to retrain yourself. But in this case, there apparently wasn't. And so like the fable of the bees, the fable of QWERTY turned out to be a dud as well. And I argue in one of my articles that I published that this also has everything exactly ass backwards, because when you think about it, where we really have locked in inferior technology is government. That's where the inferior technology is. Like, here's just one recent headline that was in the news recently. The U.S. nuclear arsenal is controlled by 1970s computers with 8-inch floppy disks. I'm old enough to have used floppy disks. I bought my first IBM PC in 1983, but they weren't 8-inch floppy disks. They were 4-inch. They were not 8-inch floppy disks. And so talk about path dependence and locking in inferior technology. And I'm working a paper on this. If you just, this is a note I wrote to myself. It says, Google, quote, outdated government technology. I did that just before I left to come here. And there's a big, long list of articles like this, on the web. And so that's where the outdated technology comes from. The next example I'll give is the asymmetric information problem. And I guess one of the pioneering articles of this was written by Mr. Janet Yellen. Yeah, Janet Yellen's husband. You know who Janet Yellen is, the chairman of the Fed, or chairwoman of the Fed. Her husband is George Akerlof, a Harvard professor. And he wrote an article on what is known as the lemons problem in economics in 1970 in the American Economic Review. And the story that's told is, for example, a used car dealer has more information about the quality of the used car than the buyer, than you, the customer. Therefore, he's able to rip you off and sell you a lemon. And he predicted that the whole used car market would disappear because of this. It'd be such a severe market failure that the whole used car market would just be non-existent. This is 1970, and there were already warranties on used cars in 1970. So and of course nowadays, if you buy a car from CarMax, so that's a big used car place in the U.S., I think they still give you 5 days to take it back, no questions answered. If you decide you don't like the car, and 30-day warranties, you can buy inexpensive extended warranties. So that pretty much solved the problem. So the problem of asymmetric information that he complained about was already solved at the time by product warranties at the time he wrote the article. But nevertheless, there's a huge literature. Joe Stiglitz has written hundreds of articles, I think, about this because it's an easy nirvana fallacy thing to do. It's easy to posit that well, gee, I, the purchaser of an automobile, don't know nearly as much as an automotive engineer who works for General Motors about the workings of an automobile, don't I? And I, as a consumer of steak, don't know nearly as much as a rancher who raises cattle and brings the steak to market and all this stuff. Yeah, that's true. That's true. So this is seen as one big market failure problem. But I published a short article about this in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics in 2011. And I'll just give you a couple of things that I wrote here. I quoted Hayek. I basically argue that asymmetric information is why markets exist. It's another word for it would be the division of labor, or the division of labor and knowledge. I teach economics. I make money teaching economics and writing books and things like that, and I use that to buy the things that I buy: my house, my food, and so forth. And so that's what makes civilization exist, that the international division of labor and knowledge. We all have specialized knowledge in something in our work lives, and we make money doing that, and we rely on other people to provide us with our other goods. And so, but it's really the same thing as what they're saying is asymmetric information. There wouldn't be markets without asymmetric information. Here's what Hayek said in 1964. We need to remember only how much we have to learn in any occupation after we have completed our theoretical training, how big a part of our working life we spend learning particular jobs, and how valuable an asset in all walks of life is knowledge of people, of local conditions, and of special circumstances. The shipper who earns his living from using otherwise empty or half-filled journeys of tramp steamers, or the estate agent whose whole knowledge is almost exclusively one of temporary opportunities, or the arbitrageur who gains from local differences of commodity prices, are all performing eminently useful functions based on special knowledge of circumstances of the fleeting moment not known to others. Asymmetric information. He's saying that's what makes the market work, that we all have different knowledge. And I ask in my article, ask yourself these questions. Who knows more about home building, home builders or home buyers? Who knows more about supplying grocery stores with fresh meat, ranchers and farmers or consumers? Who knows more about manufacturing automobiles, automobile engineers or car purchasers? It's the whole marketplace is based on asymmetric information. I also quote Mises, who didn't use the words asymmetric information, but he wrote about the topic. And I'll quote very briefly this. It says, in an economic system in which every actor is in a position to recognize correctly the market situation with the same degree of insight, the adjustment of prices to every change in the data would be achieved at one stroke. Perfect information, non-asymmetric information, in other words. It is impossible to imagine such uniformity in the correct cognition and appraisal of changes in data except by the intercession of superhuman agencies. So only God could create a situation where there's non-asymmetric or symmetric information. Okay, we would have to assume that every man is approached by an angel informing him of the change in data, Mises wrote. And he says, if market participants did possess the same data and information, they are bound to appraise it differently, even if you did have the same information. That's after all, that's why markets work. You and I could have the exact same information about my bag here, but if you are in need of a new bag and I decide I'm too old to be wearing a knapsack anymore and I should sell it to a student, we look at the exact same physical object, we have the exact same information, but we trade. I get rid of it, you buy it. If we can agree on a price, that's why markets exist. And so I make the case once again that this is also ass backwards, to use the scientific language for this. And I also make the case that the real asymmetric information problem is in government. Just look at foreign policy, for example. Who has more information about the next war we're about to jump into, the dozen or two people who start the war, or you and me? Who has more information about that, or about anything government does? Government secrets. Okay, and so that's asymmetric information. Now, the free rider problem is also, greatly exaggerated, I think. The way it's taught by most economists, though, and in most textbooks, that students tend to get the impression that this is some sort of ironclad, insurmountable problem of markets, the free rider problem, whenever there's something in the form of a public good. And one example that I'll give you of something that I've written about is, as a lot of you know, if you've read it, some of you have read some of my books, I'm interested in economic history. And one of the things I wrote about in a couple of my books is the debates that began with Jefferson and Hamilton and went through the Civil War, so-called, about internal improvements or government subsidies for railroads, roads, canals, things like that, public works, so-called. And even beginning with Alexander Hamilton in the U.S., he articulated the free rider problem and said private markets would never finance in sufficient amounts road building, canal building. Therefore, we need government spending to do this. And American president after American president vetoed all of that until Lincoln came along. It was all, that's when it was all put in place. But they all vetoed. Madison, the father of the Constitution, his very last day as president, vetoed a bill that was about giving a bonus bill to veterans, I believe it was, and in there someone had snuck some money for road building, and the father of the U.S. Constitution said, to paraphrase him, I can't put my finger on the part of the Constitution that allows us to spend money on that, something like that. And other presidents said something similar. But I quote an article on this topic of government subsidies for road building because of the free rider problem. Dan Klein, economist Dan Klein, wrote an article in the Economic Inquiry some years ago about early American road building. And here's what he says. The private road building movement built new roads at rates previously unheard of in America. Over $11 million was invested in turnpikes in New York. He's talking about the period 1800, 1801, 1802. Hamilton was still alive. Some 6.5 million in New England, over 4.5 million in Pennsylvania. Between 1794 and 1840, 238 private New England turnpike companies built and operated about 3,750 miles of road. New York led all other states in turnpike mileage with over 4,000 miles as of 1821. So even when this debate was started by Hamilton, private road building companies were busy building all the roads and canals with private funding, private investors. How did they do this? Well, yeah, there was a free rider problem, and at the time you could maybe make 10% on an investment somewhere, but only 3% if you invested in one of these turnpike companies, or 4%. But people also realized that if their little town was connected to the next town over, it could double the size of the market for their goods that they wanted to sell, and vice versa. They would have more competition coming in to sell them things, maybe at lower prices. And so the people did that, and they used social ostracism to get their neighbors to invest and cooperate in this back in early America. And so they didn't use the barrel of a gun, which is the governmental method. Pay up or die, or pay up or we will make you live in a cage for 7 years, something like that. The final example I'll give of market failure mythology has to do with pollution. And I wrote a couple of articles years ago. It was very interesting when socialism collapsed around the world in the late 80s and early 90s. There were all these closed societies that were all of a sudden people from the West could go into East Germany and Poland and these places that had been part of the Soviet Union, and people did. The journalists, the United Nations sent people, the academics of all sorts could walk around and look around for the first time in decades. And one of the things I was thinking about at that time was that, well, how is this going to affect the theory of negative externalities? Because after all, the theory of negative externalities that was first articulated by Arthur C. Pigou, the British economist, was that because of in unregulated markets, the pursuit of profit will lead businesses to only consider the private costs and not the external costs like pollution of their factories. Therefore, the government needs to come in and regulate in the public interest or tax in the public interest corporations that polluting. So the root cause of pollution is the pursuit of profit in unregulated markets. Well, here we have a natural experiment. We had where the pursuit of profits in unregulated markets was outlawed for 40, 50, 70 years in all these countries. So what would you expect the environment to look like in these places? Pristine, heaven on earth, look like Al Gore's backyard, something like that. And of course, the exact opposite was true. There was an environmental hellhole. There were books written with titles like Ecocide in the USSR, and I gathered all this up. I wrote a bunch of articles at the time about this, and there's stories of the Russians almost depleted the caviar by the sturgeon population, pretty much disappeared in Russia. The Volga River in Russia had signs of a steamboat going down the Volga River had signs on it: "Do not throw cigarettes overboard. The river may catch on fire because there's so many chemicals in the river." There were 70 years of untreated sewage pumped into the Aral Sea and other big bodies of water in Russia. And one memorable thing is they found an island of alkaline sewage 3 miles wide and 8 miles long floating around in the Aral Sea. And you can imagine being on a nice sunny day like this out on your sailboat, and you fall asleep after a couple of beers and you wake up with a big thud. You crash into something and it's an 8 mile long chunk of sewage. That's the sort of. There were in Poland, the air pollution was so bad in Poland that they had water cannons going through downtown Krakow and Warsaw several times a day to knock the lead and cadmium dust out of the air in Poland. And if you had lung disease in Poland, they had underground clinics in uranium mines, and underground uranium mines. That's where they sent you in Poland if you had lung disease from all this. And so we've had our problems here, but if you read about what happened in the countries that outlawed markets altogether, the environmental problems were many orders of magnitude worse. And so the conclusion is that once again, there has to be something more to it in terms of the sources of pollution than just corporate greed, the pursuit of profit. Because after all, if you have a system of property rights that punishes people from harming others, whether through pollution or any other means, that can be a deterrent, can it? If private property and the liability that goes along with private property. They had none of that in the socialist world. And so it was one big commons, and they despoiled the commons. In Czechoslovakia, one anecdote I remember, decades of chemical fertilizer had made the soil toxic down to a foot deep where nothing would grow. But American capitalists came to the rescue. They actually have soil cleansing machines that they went and used the soil cleansing machines to restore their farmland to viability after the collapse of communism. Okay, so those are my stories, and I'm sticking to it about the myths of market failure. There are many more myths of market failure, and for those of you who are looking for dissertation topics or just paper topics, it's the sky's the limit as far as that goes, because there are so many of these theories out there. And I guess our time is about up, and I'm going to stick around for office hours. Thank you for not falling asleep.